Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Gemma Higas. I'm a keyboard player, composer, and hopefully successful YouTuber one day if you decide that you like this video and subscribe to my channel. So let's get into it. I'm gonna explain to you why being a female musician in today's day and age gives you a real advantage over your male counterparts.
Wait, are you serious?
Yes! I understand that the title of this video may sound a little bit insensitive or crass. I get that, but hear me out. Having worked in the music industry myself, I can say that it's not easy for anyone.
The struggle is real.
If your primary goal in life is to have a lot of money, music is probably not the way to go. I remember when I was taking a tour of my music school, the first thing that they asked me was, is there anything else that you're interested apart from music? Because if so, you should go and do that right now.
Make your choice.
But really, there was nothing else that I enjoyed, so I just did it.
Okay, let's do it.
Before I dive into my argument, yes, I've made sure to check my privilege.
Damn, girl.
I recognize that these factors have put me at an advantage, so I don't take that for granted. Now, when it comes to my point, I think that I've had even more of an advantage because of my gender.
Wait, what?
And before you get mad at me, let me explain why. The thing is, historically, women have always been at a disadvantage when it comes to the music industry. We can go all the way back to the medieval era and see where this inequality came to be.
History time.
In ancient societies like Greece, music was extremely important in religion and rituals, but women had pretty much no involvement at all. We were allowed to sing in private, but public performances were a no-go. We were confined to domestic roles, singing lullabies and folk songs, indoors to our children. Those were definitely important to the culture, but you would never see a woman performing outside.
Go back to the kitchen where you belong.
Meanwhile, men would show off their talents all the time out in public. Instruments were actually considered a symbol of masculinity, so naturally, women were denied access. Another big factor was modesty. Back then, women weren't allowed to show off or be talented in that way because it would attract unwanted male attention, and that wasn't okay. So instead, we could only remain in private spaces or in religious rituals where only other women could see us. Women were just childbearers and submissive wives that would take care of household duties. Music education was also reserved for men because families prioritized investing in sons who were seen as having greater potential.
The sky's the limit.
Plus, musical instruments were expensive, and they still are. Daughters weren't given the opportunity to learn because why would you buy an instrument for someone that wasn't allowed to play it? At least women could sing to their babies. After ancient Greece fell, Christianity rose, and one of the first real opportunities for female musicians came in the form of Christian nuns. Within the context of worship, women were actually allowed to sing and even play the harp and the organ, but their performances always stayed within the convent walls for God's ears only. High-class noblewomen also learned to sing and play the harp, but not as a celebrated talent. It was more like an entertaining skill that added value to their marriage. But it's still worth noting because it was the first real instance of women playing instruments as a hobby.
Medieval period.
Fast forward to the 11th and 12th centuries, which saw the emergence of the troubadours. I hope I'm saying that right. These were poet musicians, men who sang about unattainable love. These men were rich, famous, and loved by the elite. Wow. With them came the troubadours, their female counterparts. Women with a high enough social standing started composing songs too, responding often to troubadour themes. These women were some of the first to sing in semi-public performances where they could be seen and heard in a musical setting. Unfortunately, that brief window of opportunity hit a wall after the troubadours fell off.
Time's up.
Baroque period.
We might as well have done nothing for 400 years because women were basically yeeted out of the music scene altogether.
Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Between the 13th and the 17th centuries, we regressed back to only singing in private performances that no one else could hear, in religious settings or in domestic places. Rich noblewomen also continued to play acceptable instruments at home, such as the lute or the harpsichord. But instruments like brass, percussion, or even violin were considered unsuitable because they were associated with strength and masculinity. This time period is not giving me much to work with, so let's just fast forward to the 17th century because I'm getting really bored.
Baroque period.
Towards the middle of the Baroque period, there was a small shift in culture. Some women were allowed to play instruments in public settings, particularly within noble families or royal courts, where they would have had access to private tutors. When I say publicly, just think of really fancy events or ceremonies where the rules for social behavior were really strict and the chance for unwanted male attention or immodesty were practically none. Any other context and a female musician would get shamed and judged.
Shame. Shame.
Regardless, there were still actually a couple of notable female composers that emerged during this time, and that's pretty impressive because they were basically told no their entire lives and they did it anyway. One such composer was Francesca Caccini, who was an amazing opera singer. She greatly contributed to the musical theater of that time, writing countless acts and specializing in comedies. But tragically, only one of her works survived. It is the oldest opera ever composed by a woman.
That cracks me up.
Religious convents and charities also began offering women a chance for musical education in this time. One notable example is Anna Maria della Pieta. She was Vivaldi's student and a virtuoso. With her impressive talent, she would have been one of the few that could actually showcase his work, with many musicologists believing that she was the inspiration behind many of his violin concertos. For example, it's probable that his piece, Concerto for Two Violins in A minor, was written with her in mind, and possibly with her contribution. It's also probable that she was a performer in the concerts that Vivaldi organized at the Hospital, which was a charity that raised and gave a rigorous musical education to orphaned girls. Even though public performances were a huge no-no, this institution was an exception to that rule. Hidden behind a screen for modesty and anonymity, the talented women of the Hospital would perform for people from all over the world who were drawn to the acclaim and respect of the organization. In this unique and charitable context, it was actually one of the few instances where female musicians were celebrated.
Classical period.
The 18th century brought the classical period, and with it, some progress for women.
Christ, it's about time.
It might seem super limited by today's standards, but it was definitely an improvement in terms of women's access to music education and opportunities. What used to be the exception was now basically a requirement for high-class women. Every fancy lady was not only encouraged, but expected to pick up an instrument. The main focus was something called the pianoforte, which was the early piano, and also the harpsichord. For normal, non-fancy ladies, education became more common as well, and women actually started to take classes in composition and instrumental music. The downside was that they were still not allowed to perform in public ever, and those that did perform would only do so in very rare private events. For example, Fanny Mendelssohn was a talented composer, virtuosic pianist, and the sister of the guy that wrote the Wedding March. Although her and her brother wrote a ton of music and actually shared the same education, Fanny was never allowed to have her music performed. The only way she was initially able to publish her music at all was under her younger brother Felix's name. He then went down in history as one of the greatest composers ever. Unfortunately, Fanny just never got the same credit. Even after she was finally allowed to publish one of her own works under her own name, it was still inaccurately accredited to her younger brother. Romantic period. For the first time, this period actually brought about some real change. Women were finally starting to be allowed to step out of the private sphere and perform in public concerts, which were on the rise during the 19th century. One of the ways women shined during this time was through opera. Unlike orchestras, opera houses actually welcomed women and gave them the opportunity to achieve widespread recognition. Just take Jenny Lind, who became one of the first female superstars. She was a Swedish opera singer whose angelic voice and humble personality made the public fall absolutely head over heels in love with her. She was one of the earliest examples of a global celebrity back then when it wasn't really a thing, especially not for women. She was already super popular in Europe, but after her US tour, a phenomenon that can only be described as Lind Mania swept the nation, with massive media coverage and fans obsessing over her. They would pack every single concert that she performed at. The fact that she rose to such fame and adoration proved that women's voices could be heard in the music industry. Unfortunately, there are no recordings of her voice, only written accounts. Now, in the instrumental realm, the piano became sort of a gateway drug for women to break into the music industry. Most people were still pretty adverse to the idea of women playing instruments, but the piano was special because it let them maintain this idea of grace and femininity. Basically, people didn't like to see women in awkward or unflattering poses. So puffing your cheeks out with a really loud trumpet was not cool, but sitting pretty at the piano was a perfect compromise, finally giving female instrumentalists a medium in which the public would finally accept them.
All right, I can live with that.
Like Clara Schumann, for example. Clara was a composer and a force of nature on the piano. She was known for her technical brilliance and emotional depth, starring as a child prodigy on tour in Europe. She went on to perform internationally and set a new precedent for female instrumentalists, becoming known as one of the most virtuosic players of her time, male or female. Which is crazy because she, along with her husband, the great Robert Schumann, were able to maintain a family of 8 children. What?
Looks like a full house.
No idea how she did that, but she demonstrated that women could excel both as performers and composers in a professional and public setting. The music you're listening to is hers, by the way. Orchestras were still reserved for only men, but female instrumentalists began to appear more commonly in small ensembles like salons. These gatherings were hosted and attended by rich people and would frequently showcase female soloists, particularly the flute, violin, piano, and of course, vocalists. Salons became really popular during the 1800s and helped normalize the idea of women playing instruments professionally and in public.
20th century.
Well, we've made it to the 1900s, where things start to get interesting. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, and even electronic music burst onto the scene, and the energy was high. This period was a huge turning point for women. Changes in society, 2 world wars, and advancements in technology disrupted the normal gender roles, and women started to be able to do things that they were never allowed or able to do. In the early parts of the 20th century, phonographs became popular, which allowed music to be recorded and played back. Then radios became a thing, which meant that people could listen to live and recorded music in their own homes. Around the same time, the women's suffrage movement started gaining a lot of traction, which eventually ended in women getting the right to vote. And there was a huge shortage of men in the workforce because they were out fighting the First World War. This shortage included the entertainment industry, and for the first time, women started to work in traditionally male jobs, like orchestras or band leaders. Women were actually sought after for the first time because there just weren't enough men to go around. Public performances actually ended up becoming very common because women were a huge part of boosting morale during the war. This shift also benefited marginalized groups who had been excluded from public platforms completely. The absence of men, along with the development of new technologies, brought new opportunities for Black jazz and blues musicians to be recognized. Ella Fitzgerald was a perfect example of someone who was able to break out during this time. As a Black woman, she faced double the challenges, but her insane vocal ability was able to transcend everything. Through radio, she was able to reach an audience that would have never heard her before, and her talent did the rest of the talking. If you haven't ever heard Ella Fitzgerald sing, just sit back and enjoy.
Da
As you can probably hear, Ella Fitzgerald is a virtuosic improviser who is widely considered to be the best jazz vocalist of all time. She's been an influence on pretty much every single jazz player since then. For me, nobody tops Ella, but if you know someone that you think can contend, feel free to let me know in the comments. Later on, technology had a huge boom. I could probably go on and on and on about what happened because there was so much, but I want to get to my point, so let me try to consolidate. Television became popular in the 50s.
I go out walking after midnight,
which brought huge visibility, along with completely new ideas about what it was to be a female in the music industry. The whole strong, independent woman trope had literally never been done before, and it was a huge hit. Pop stars like Madonna and Whitney Houston burst onto the scene, bringing a new way to market themselves and showcase their own personality and visual style. Although female instrumentalists were still rare because of, well, everything I've already talked about, they became more common than they ever had before, such as Nina Simone. Or Karen Carpenter, who absolutely shredded on the drums before her rising fame and popularity pressured her to perform as a singer instead.
What a surprise!
Check her out because it's really impressive. The rest is pretty much history. If you're a 90s baby like me, you'll probably remember the birth of the internet, which was a complete cultural shift. It feels like as soon as that happened, society pretty much evolved at hyperspeed. It wasn't long at all until the days of
You've got mail.
Turned into Facebook and Instagram, letting everyone be an individual and express themselves however they wanted. The landscape had totally changed and barriers were being broken everywhere. Modern day.
Why being a female musician is actually easier.
So here we are in modern times. Now that I've talked your ear off about women in history, you're probably wondering where I'm going with all of this. If you haven't noticed, women haven't exactly had much of a chance. At every step, even outside of music, there's always been some sort of obstacle or hurdle that we have to jump through, preventing us from pursuing our dreams or careers. While I was researching this video, I was actually really shocked to learn how cruel and restrictive society used to be to women and how recent all of this female empowerment and opportunities that we have actually is. The fact that I was born in this era and I'm allowed to do what I do is nothing short of extreme luck. If anything, this video made me rethink some misconceptions that I've had about my own gender. I feel like there's this idea that women, particularly instrumentalists, don't play as well as men. I went to music school and I heard this sentiment echoed many times. And honestly, I kind of agreed. But rather than just dismissing it as a stereotype, I realize now that it's a societal constraint. It hasn't even been 100 years that we've been allowed to play instruments and be independent musicians. Just 200 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to play the piano outside of my own house. Actually, I probably wouldn't have had access to a piano at all because my parents wouldn't have supported my interest in music. So it makes sense that people might notice a difference in skill. But it's not because women are less talented or less capable. It's because men have had such a ridiculous head start on us that it would be crazy to assume that we could play catch up in just 20 years. That brings me to my point. How, after centuries of being dismissed and denied access altogether, can I believe that being a female musician is easy in any way? Well, it's because of the same reasons that it wasn't easy before. Those historical barriers, the lack of support, and the fight for recognition. That's actually what makes it easier nowadays. Being a female musician is a niche that is growing, and being a part of this is seen as a statement. It's basically become a trend to have female representation in music, and there's a genuine appreciation where there wasn't before. In many ways, our presence is an achievement in itself, and people are drawn to that. I've even landed gigs because the client wanted an all-female band. But beyond the novelty, there's actually a cultural shift happening where audiences genuinely prefer to watch a woman perform. It also doesn't hurt that the music industry is highly visual, and And let's face it, women can use that to their advantage. This shift is less about being better than men and more about admiring the resilience that it takes to break these barriers. Seeing women take center stage brings inspiration for audiences, especially those who haven't been represented. And then there's this. Being a female musician is impressive enough on its own, but now with social media, we can capitalize on that, and let's face it, the algorithm is often in our favor. Now that society celebrates diversity and inclusion, dare I say that sometimes women have an easier time racking up a following or getting gigs. But here's where it gets even better. If you're one of those women that has actually taken the time to practice and master your instrument, your chances in today's day and age of success is so much higher. A really talented female musician often stands out way more than her male equivalent. I guess it's because they don't really expect it from us. How could they after so long? So there's always this added layer of respect when a female instrumentalist has honed her craft to the same level as her male counterpart. And it's a message to the world that we're able to break those old stereotypes. It's not just about being a woman playing music. It's about the effort, determination, and skill that it takes to overcome the obstacles that society has put in place. So when we succeed, it feels more than just a personal achievement. It's a win for every woman that has been told that she couldn't. That's why, in many ways, being a woman in the music industry isn't just a personal triumph. It's a reflection of how far we've come and how much more we have left to achieve. So this is actually my first long-form YouTube video. So if you enjoyed it, please take the time to give it a thumbs up. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel because I'll definitely be doing more content like this in the future. For more music content, you can follow me on Instagram. And if you're interested in getting better at piano and learning a little bit about music theory, then you are welcome to subscribe to my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers!